So far this summer, we've seen some pretty big strikes. 40,000 rail workers walked out over pay and conditions in June and July, as did 10,000 London Underground workers, and over 40,000 BT workers downed tools over 2 days at the end of July and the beginning of August. Now joining them are workers at Royal Mail. They've just announced a series of one-day strikes later this month. And when the posties walk out, it will be in staggering numbers, with 115,000 workers set to strike, making it the biggest strike of the summer so far. And Royal Mail bosses are spooked. This was the FT's headline in response. Royal Mail warns on material UK losses if strikes proceed. Well, yes, that's the point of strikes. Threatening the bottom line is the only bargaining power workers have. But fears of material losses didn't stop Royal Mail from paying out £400 million to shareholders last year, nor did it stop them from transferring over 70,000 shares to Royal Mail Chief Financial Officer Mick Jevons on the very same day that the strikes were announced. At today's value, that stock is worth nearly £200,000. That's on top of the £465,000 salary that was agreed when Jevons was appointed in 2021. Meanwhile, Chief Executive Simon Thompson's pay package is worth a staggering £753,000. Royal Mail's total profits for last year were £758 million, and yet it imposed a mere 2% pay rise on workers after the Communications Workers Union, the CWU, balloted for strike action. Now, that's in the context of inflation running at 13% later this year and 18% if you use the more realistic RPI measure. The CWU's General Secretary, Dave Ward, said this: "Nobody takes the decision to strike lightly, but postal workers are being pushed to the brink. There can be no doubt that postal workers are completely united in their determination to secure the dignified, proper pay rise they deserve. We can't keep on living in a country where bosses rake in billions in profit while their employees are forced to use food banks." The CWU's message to Royal Mail's leadership is simple: there will be serious disruption until you get real on pay. The strikes are set to take place on Friday the 26th of August and Wednesday the 31st of August, as well as on Thursday and Friday the 8th and 9th of September. Dahlia, has it only just dawned on Royal Mail management that a prolonged strike will actually hit their bottom line?
Well, I mean, I don't know where they've been. What would they expect otherwise? When we are facing one of the most intense inflation crises in living memory, and the governing party is, flailing around with culture war bullshit and infighting, does it surprise me that across so many different sectors, we are seeing an eruption of organized labor, and organized labor that is taking seriously? It's not a joke. They're not playing around with, mealy-mouthed forms of strike action. That they're hitting it where it hurts, because that is the position that we are in right now. This is a public emergency, and the solution needs to come, not in 6 months, not in a year, not in a year and a half. It needs to come like yesterday. So, of course, they shouldn't be surprised, because working class people, when they are pushed like this, they always fight back. That has been true throughout history. That fight back is not always successful, unfortunately, but it always happens. And, working class people have a right to say that. They have a right to say, we are not going to shoulder the brunt of this crisis alone after a pandemic, after a decade of austerity on steroids, and several more decades before that of our basic needs, our basic services being privatized, being turned into an asset class in order to make rich people richer. This crisis, it's not of our making. We spent 2 years being miserable in lockdowns while you guys were popping champagne corks. And now, whilst the richest companies are making unprecedented profits like Royal Mail, everyday workers are not going to sit down and be made to suffer. So, as I said before, it is entirely historically precedented that we will see a pattern of strikes and militant strikes breaking out across different sectors, including the postal services, because as it stands, the only institutions representing regular people, the basic needs of regular people in this crisis are the trade unions. And what is really significant, I think, about this wave in general is not only the fact that we are seeing strikes spilling out quite consistently now across traditionally middle class professional sectors, like like barristers, like academics, like doctors. The chair of the British Medical Association last month said that NHS doctor strikes are basically inevitable. But what is also interesting is that we are also seeing these strikes spilling out into the private sector. Across the pond, we're seeing really amazing strike action in hospitality sector, in Starbucks, in Amazon factories, amongst gig economy workers. And of course, the postal service in the UK is now in the private sector. It has been fully privatized. That's really significant because these are not historically well unionized sectors. I think about 50% of the public sector is unionized, but only like 12% of the private sector is unionized. So the strikes in these particular sectors, private sectors and middle class professional sectors, are really, really interesting and demonstrate a real shift in consciousness around what actually we need to do to tackle this crisis. But what will actually decide, whether or not we win is not about, the individual disputes within sectors. It has to be a generalization of this action, union solidarity across sectors, across races, across genders, and even to an extent across classes, between the working class and the middle class, and of course across national borders. And what is also really important is the refusal of the pitting of workers against consumers. That was really central to Thatcher's successful attack on the unions. And we are seeing the beginnings of that starting to kind of come in. We saw it with the tube strikes, with the transport worker strikes. So that is something that we have to be very vigilant against. But luckily, it looks like the union movement is really taking heed of that. And we are beginning to see the generalization of of strike action across different sectors, the coordination of strike action with the Enough is Enough campaign, and then also the breaking down of that worker versus consumer division with the buy-in of unions with the Don't Pay campaign. So this is all, we've got a really rocky road ahead because I'm sure that we will see the full force of the state to try and break this building of union power. But we are seeing the beginnings of some really good strategies that I think actually give us, a chance of fighting back and winning.
What is happening and what's about to happen is extraordinary. We've talked about CPI, Consumer Price Index, which is what the Bank of England uses. They said last week it's going to go to 13%. We talked about it going to 18% if you use RPI. RPI is the real rate of inflation. It includes things like mortgage repayments, student loans, etc. So that's the real rate of inflation. CPI is kind of cooking the books. When you have the real rate of inflation at 18%, you should be offering workers like 9, 10, 11%. They're still going to get poorer, but it's at least mitigating it a little bit. And I feel, Dahlia, that yes, people are getting their act together in the labour movement and social movements and so on, but this is so bad. This is like the 1970s without the pay rises. I think RPI, which was the inflation measure we used in the 20th century, we stopped using it, like I say, because we want to cook the books. The highest it went was 25%. You had wages keeping up, right? That was the point. This time you don't. And I think the political management of that, I think there's no historical memory for it. Whether that's amongst private bosses, whether it's the government, whether it's police chiefs and people who care about public order. I think this is really dangerous terrain for the British state apparatus.